When it comes to J.L. Shellenberg's hiddenness argument, is it possible that a loving God can exist, and yet for some capable people that could enter into a relationship with God, God wouldn't be open to a relationship with them? But that lack of openness is consistent with God being unsurpassably loving. Is that possible? If it is, then we've just shown that premise 2 in the argument is false. This is what's at stake in Justin Schieber's latest video. It's really excellent. I really thank him for giving a response to my initial response to the argument. And now where we've landed is on a discussion or a debate between Daniel Howard-Snyder and J.L. Schellenberg. And what's really exciting about Justin's video is at the end of it, he's actually pressing on a new way of responding. He's sort of at the outer limit of the literature. Welcome to Christian Philosophy Academy. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Christopher Kloos. I have a PhD in philosophy, and I love to think about God, theism, Christianity, and I love dialoguing with atheists and with theists about these issues. If you're getting started and you want a great resource for 5 powerful arguments for God, then I've just given you a breakdown with quick hits of exactly what you need to know about those arguments. Go check out christianphilosophyacademy.com/5 arguments. And there you can download this free resource and use it to launch your studies on 5 really important arguments for God. Now, the premise in the argument that is at stake in Schellenberg and Schneider's discussion is premise number 2. And you can kind of forget about the numbering because it's confusing. It changes from presentation to presentation. But this is the premise that says, for shorthand, if God loving, then always open. Okay? So you can just think of it as the premise that if God is loving, then God is always open. And there's a little bit more details that it's good to spell out. God's loving is unsurpassably loving. That is, God is maximally loving toward created beings. And that means that God wants to unite with them. God wants their best, wishes the best for them. Now, always open, what does that mean? Well, it just really means not closed. Okay? So not closed. Now, what does it mean that God is not closed to a relationship? Well, it means there's nothing that God has done to prevent that person who's capable of being in a relationship with him from doing something. God hasn't done anything by omission or commission that would prevent that person from entering into a relationship with him just by trying. So if God truly exists and God is perfectly loving, then any closing off to the relationship will always happen on the person's side, not God's side. That is, if a person is resistant toward a relationship with God, then that will make sense why they can't, just by trying, enter into a relationship with God. After all, they're resisting a relationship with God. But if they're not resisting a relationship with God, if they're a non-resistant non-believer, then it should always be the case that an open God will provide evidence sufficient for that person to discover that he exists so that they can at least minimally start a relationship. And what that means is a conscious, meaningful, reciprocal relationship. So here's the thing. Now that we have that understanding on the table, and I'm using this excellent text, Hidden Divinity, and specifically I'm looking at Daniel Howard-Snyder's article, Divine Openness and Creaturely Non-Resistant Non-Belief, which is the subject of Schieber's recent reply to my video. So it says, necessarily, if God is unsurpassably loves such persons, then for any capable person at any time, then God is always open to being in a relationship with that person at that time. One thing that it's important to point out about this premise is just how low the bar is for arguing that it's false. That is, because it's necessarily the case that if God is unsurpassably loving, then God is always open for relationship. In order to counter this, all you have to argue is that it's possible that an unsurpassably loving God exists and yet isn't open to a relationship with a person at a time. Now, that time index is really important because there can be situations compatible with a perfectly loving God, God being hidden for a time. And the example that's at issue in this discussion is at the start of a relationship. So the objection that Daniel Howard-Snyder raises and that Schieber responds to is what's called the Better Start Objection. Basically, it's compatible with God's perfect love that in certain situations, God waits for the person to be in a better position to more readily, for the right reasons, enter into a relationship with God in order for the relationship as a whole to go better and for the person to perhaps have a deeper or a more meaningful relationship with God. Now, after canvassing what it means for a person to be ill-disposed for a relationship with God, like they were raised in an atheist family that said, being a believer is just for people who are weak, and it's not true, they're just reaching out. He notices that it's possible then that a person would grow up, and when they became capable of entering into a relationship with God, they would resist that relationship because they were ill-disposed toward being in a relationship with God. Well, then he moves on to consider, because that would be a resistive, believer or non-believer. And in this case, of course, we want a non-resistant non-believer. So what Daniel Howard-Snyder imagines is that the person is well-disposed to being in a relationship with God, and there are a couple of different ways they could have that disposition. So the first way is...
Start now.
A few moments later.
So, according to the first way, this person is not responsible for being well disposed. And then the second case is when they are responsible for being well disposed. Right here is where they're not responsible. That can be like due to social indoctrination. So like you had the atheist family that says, being a believer in God is just for the weak, and it's not true. You can have another family that is pushing religion, but doing it in a very positive light. That is, like, God is the source of good, God is all loving, you should love God. By loving God, you're right with Him and your life goes well. So there's sort of, as the child is going through his or her rearing stages, they're being sort of pumped with indoctrination toward belief in God. Then, when it comes to two, you can have a person who's responsible for being well-disposed, but the reasons that they're well-disposed are not well-motivated. That is, they sort of are disposed to God for reasons that they're responsible for, but they're the wrong sort of reason. So what might be examples of that? Well, they might have unfitting motivations. They might want to enter into a relationship with God not because of who God is and what God has done for them, but just because selfishly they want to feel better, or it's all about them. They want what they can get from God, so to speak. So power and influence. Perhaps they want to enter into it for like a social club, so they belong to a church and have church community, and there's nothing wrong with that, but perhaps God wants them to want to enter into a relationship for reasons other than social influence and power, and out of fear, and just to be part of a peer group, or to please your parents, or to be part of a social group. So here we can say that this is wrong reasons. So we can say wrong reasons. Okay? And then for the other one, we can say no ownership. That is, For the person not responsible for being well disposed and entering into a relationship with God, they haven't taken ownership of their good disposition to being in that relationship. Remember, they've just sort of been indoctrinated into that disposition. They're not responsible for it. It was foisted upon them. Then we have the wrong sort of reasons. So the wrong sort of reasons, again, are rooted in self-interested desires instead of God-centered desires. Instead of wanting to enter into a relationship with God because of who God is and perhaps what He has done, you do it because it's all about you. It's all about what you can get out of this relationship with God. So God might be perfectly loving and yet want to wait for the person who's not responsible for being well disposed to confirm that good disposition, to take ownership of that good disposition, which they weren't responsible for acquiring in the first place, or may want that person to enter into a relationship with God for the right sort of reason, God-centered reasons as opposed to self-interested reasons. Now, here's another important part. For Shellenberg, there's no lag time between the onset of the capacity to enter into a relationship with God and God revealing Himself to that person such that that person believes that He exists. Okay, because of two. Remember, two, if God's unsurpassably loving, then God is always open to such a relationship with any person at any time. And any closing off or resisting of the relationship will always happen on the human side, not God's side. But let's go ahead and clarify this by drawing a couple of lines to show what Schellenberg is committed to and then what Daniel Howard-Snyder is actually arguing is going on.
A few moments later.
All right, so now what do we got? Well, let's take a look here at a timeline. This is a timeline here, okay? This will be Schellenberg's. We'll say Shellenberg's. Okay, so for any person right here, S, at time T, capable of being in a relationship with God, capable, they have the capacity to being in a relationship with God, then God, at that exact time, God will be open to a relationship with that person at that time, and at that time, the person S at T will believe that God exists. Okay, so just going back over it, this always has to line up perfectly for Schellenberg. That is, there'll never be a gap in a person being capable of being in a relationship with God and God also being open to that relationship with that person such that that person at that time can come to believe that God exists just by trying. God will always provide evidence sufficient for that. Now, He doesn't need to foist it upon them. It doesn't need to be knocked down evidence like written in the sky, I exist and I want a relationship with you. It can be subtle, and Schieber's series in the Hiddenness argument is excellent. He does a great job going over a lot of the nuances that I won't cover today, but so I recommend checking that out. But he mentions, Schellenberg and Schieber mention that sometimes it can be very subtle, but it's sufficient. Whatever it is, however overpowering or however subtle, it would be sufficient for that person at least to start a relationship with God by believing that God exists. Okay? So, now, here's what Daniel Howard-Snyder argues. Okay, so, in this case, for Daniel Howard-Snyder, we'll just do DHS. We have our line again. Okay? What, essentially, Daniel Howard-Snyder is arguing is that, okay, you can have WD responsible, and then you can have WD not responsible. Okay, then you can have this time right here, and then you can have God over here. Okay, so what are these two? Remember, it has to always line up perfectly for Schellenberg, but for Daniel Howard-Snyder, what he's saying is there can be a lag. What's the lag? Well, this person here could we'll say S is at time, let's give it an actual number, T1, okay? S is here at time T1 and is now capable of being in a relationship with God. Okay, remember, so S at T1 capable. And here what this means is during this time, up until this person became capable, they were becoming well disposed toward God, either through their own responsibility or not through their own responsibility. Okay, and then they become capable, and yet there's no bottom part right here. That is, it's all the way until here that God actually is open to a relationship with them. So during this time, God's closed. Why? So that at this time, the relationship can get off to a great start. This is the Better Start Objection. So at this time, we have God open at, let's say, T2. And then that person, S, T2, would become a believer in God. Okay, so at that time, God would be open at T2, not T1, to being in a relationship with them. And at that time, T2, the person would actually come to believe that God exists. But during this time, the person is a non-resistant non-believer, right? Doesn't believe that God exists, is capable of believing that God exists, and yet God is waiting until the person takes ownership of their good disposition toward being in a relationship with Him, or rights those wrong reasons for entering into a relationship, such that when the time comes at T2, the person is now ready to start on the right foot a really meaningful and deep relationship with God, or at least start it for the right motivations, the right sort of reasons, and start it for the fact that the person has confirmed it. Now, we get to Schieber's first point, which is also anticipated by Shellenberg.
Is there another pair of alternatives that would be more preferable than those just outlined from the perspective of a perfectly rational and perfectly loving God, keeping in mind what has been said about perfect love in the other videos of this series? Consider these alternative divine preferences as suggested by Howard-Snyder. In the case of well-disposed non-believers who are not responsible for being so well-disposed, the alternative is this: 1 prime. That God reveals Himself to them in such a way that they believe, then they begin a personal relationship with Him, and they make their good disposition toward Him their own and confirm it within that context. And in the case of well-disposed non-believers who were responsible for being well-disposed, the alternative is this: 2 prime. That God reveals Himself to them in such a way that they believe, they begin a personal relationship with Him, and then they modify the unfitting sources of their good disposition toward God and confirm this modification. Now, in my view, it seems that 1 prime and 2 prime are clearly better states of affairs than 1 and 2, in the sense that it seems a perfectly loving God would necessarily prefer those.
Here's what Schellenberg says, and Schieber notes, what we've traded, we haven't just traded a better start for a worse start. What we've traded by doing this bit, right, where you got here, you've got S, capable and non-resistant, and then over here you've got God. Well, what you've traded is time. So you've lost time in the relationship right here, right? Whereas if you just start the thing and then have them fix stuff and take ownership of their good disposition or rectify the improper motivations for having that good disposition, then you get this time back, right, that you've lost here. But here's what I want to say: Ho contraire mo frere, my friend. That is, I'll just speak from experience here. I sort of wish that God would have done this with me. Would it have been better for God to wait to reveal Himself until I was well disposed to entering in a relationship and I had confirmed, I had taken ownership of that? And sometimes it's called like taking ownership of your faith, your commitment to God. Then I think this would have been a better scenario. And in fact, this is the way it's played out. If I would have done it here and God would have revealed Himself to me and I would have started a relationship with Him here, then what winds up happening here is you fall off the wagon. It's very likely that because you entered into a relationship with God and you hadn't taken ownership, that you sort of like second order, you want to be in a relationship with God, because you don't have that second order thing, that double want, then when times get tough and it's not that convenient to actually have a relationship with God, and there's a lot of suffering and there's a lot of unanswered questions, and believers are meh or just jerks, and they're not good representatives of Christ, and they're living duplicitous lives, then because you didn't take ownership prior to starting that relationship with God, then instead of the rosy picture of, hey, well, you'll just keep going and kind of confirm it, I think there's a far greater chance that instead of growing and taking ownership of your relationship with God, there's a greater chance that you fall off the wagon. So if you're saying, hey, it's better to just get started, don't lose the time, and then, as things go, you can sort of confirm your disposition, well, that initial start may actually impact the trajectory of the relationship, such that, this is true in my case, because I didn't take ownership and I was sort of well disposed just by being raised going to church, and I never took ownership, then when difficult questions came, when I became a philosophy major and all these questions about God came up and I wasn't prepared, I hadn't taken ownership of it, then I just easily became an atheist. I became an atheist for a number of years and just turned my back on God, and that actually led me down a dark road, but that's a whole separate story. But the main idea is that if God would have waited to reveal himself and to start the relationship until after I confirmed that it's what I wanted, then perhaps instead of falling off here, perhaps I would have stuck with him, and then this time here would have been meaningful relationship with God. Like in college, in my undergrad, instead of partying and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, I would have been over there with the Christians playing board games. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a great trade-off to partying, but that might have been what happened. And who knows, like I could have had a much richer and deeper relationship with God by now if I wouldn't have lost that time, because before even going into relationship with him, before he revealed himself to me, I was able to confirm that that's what I wanted. And it wasn't just I was in a relationship with God simply because I had been well disposed to it and I wasn't really responsible sort of for that disposition. Okay, now what about the second one? Is that really as valuable of state of affairs as the better start? God waiting to reveal himself for a time. Well, this would be just starting, and then the person within the relationship sort of changing their motivations for belief in God, and that they will modify the unfitting sources of their good disposition toward God and confirm this modification. So again, what I think we have in these alternate cases is you gain time with less quality. So remember, you can just start here, and the relationship starts a little bit rocky, and maybe it goes up like this, right? And maybe you confirm your good disposition, or you sort of develop the right sort of reasons. But if you wait and then it starts here, it starts in a better place, and I think it has a deeper and richer quality. That is, it's more likely that there will be a deeper and richer quality if from the start of entering into a relationship, you genuinely confirm that it's what you want, and you enter into it for the right sort of reasons. The meaningfulness, the reciprocalness, and perhaps even the consciousness of being in the relationship will be richer and deeper. And God just doesn't want any old relationship with you just because he needs it, or there's some sort of time, like God is losing time or something. No, God wants all of you. He wants the ultimate sort of relationship with you, not just any old relationship. So I think the better start is more valuable, or at least as valuable as these alternatives. Now, Daniel Howard-Snyder responds with this example involving Mary and Joe, and Schieber discusses it, but I actually agree with Schieber on this point, for sure. and Shellenberg, that when you look at the way that Daniel Howard-Snyder sets up the example, I think you can say that a relationship has already happened. So Daniel Howard-Snyder is trying to use this example to say, look, this is a better situation for Mary to, even though she has budding love for Joe, to wait until Joe confirms his good disposition or is battle tested that he's ready for a relationship before she enters into a relationship with him, right? So the problem is there's this go-between person who's, working both directions, and both parties, Mary and Joe, know each other exists. So it's not really analogous to the situation where, like here, you have a person and they don't even know God exists until over here. I think it's actually, the case ends up being like this, so I don't think it works, but I want to propose another example. So what would be another example of this? Well, let's imagine, using an example like this, that a person is involved in a closed adoption. So we'll call him Tom. Tom is his birth mother gives birth to him, and through a process of adoption, his adoptive parents adopt him, but the birth mother doesn't really want a relationship with him for many different reasons that are understandable, at least until he can confirm that it's what he wants. So she's going to stay out of the lives of the adoptive parents, let them raise him, and if at a time he's older, he confirms that he wants to start a relationship with his birth mother, then at that time she would be open to it. Now, let's imagine, though, that she is starting to wonder what happened to him, and is he alive? Is he okay? How's he growing? What is he like, right? So she starts a process of trying to search for him. She's lost contact with the adoptive parents, and as the birth mother, she just wants to know if he's okay, right? So even though he has no clue that she exists, Tom has no clue that his birth mother exists, or at least he doesn't know. Let's say his parents sort of talk her up to him, right? They say, oh, your birth mother was so courageous. She was so this, that, and the other. So he's sort of, as he's being raised, he's sort of well disposed to entering into a relationship with her, but he's never really actually confirmed it. At this point, we can imagine like he's 7 or something, and so he doesn't even really have the capacity to be in a deep, meaningful, reciprocal relationship with her, right? So would the loving thing for the birth mother to do to wait until Joe's of age, has the capacity, and is able to not just have the capacity, but to confirm his good disposition toward entering into a relationship with her? One reason she might, out of love, want to wait is because she doesn't want to disrupt the rearing of him and cause a bunch of confusion and perhaps pain. So she waits until he's old enough and he's confirmed that this is what he wants. Maybe he reaches out for her or searches for her and finds her. Then she reveals herself to him. And I can imagine that also for her, maybe there's a sense of wanting to wait in order to know that this is really what he wants. Because if he were just to enter into a relationship with her when he's of age, because it was what his parents had sort of disposed him to do, then what if, like I mentioned, it's easy for him to fall off because he hadn't taken ownership that this was what he wanted, that he wanted to want to be in a relationship with her. And because of that, then he breaks her heart. And just after a little while, he goes, this was too much. This is a lot to work through. Wow, I have to put into, I already have two parents, and now I have to put in more to this relationship, and it's messy, it's confusing, and so on. And that would just break her heart. So perhaps she waits for that reason, like almost like a self-protective reason. But the real reason that this example applies is because you can see it's analogous to God wanting to wait until we confirm our good disposition. We can also imagine it with the other case. Maybe Joe, as he's being raised, hears about her, and perhaps her parents even say, oh, she has all sorts of money. So he's well disposed to entering into a relationship with her just because he thinks she's got a lot of money. So then she waits until he's of age and confirms that he wants to do it, but also is doing it for the right sort of reasons because he really wants to get to know his mother for who she is and to thank her for what the hard choice she made and the bravery she had in choosing to have him be put up for adoption. So you can see this is a more analogous case. Now, what Schieber says in response to the case that Daniel Howard-Snyder gives is that, look, this case between Mary and Joe, like, you don't have to start with full-blown romantic relationship. Why don't they just get the ball started with a friendship? Why don't they just get the ball started with, they already know each other exists, so, hey, even just, or imagining they don't, why not just get things going, given that there's this budding love, right? Why doesn't Mary just still start a friendship with him?
The story set before us is exclusively framed as a potential romantic relationship. But this sets up a dichotomy between no personal relationship at all and a love affair. But that right there is a big problem, because a romantic relationship isn't the only species of personal relationship that there is. What about a friendship or a casual acquaintanceship? Now, to be clear, given Mary's stipulated cautious preferences, it may well be quite good for her to hold off on diving into a specifically romantic relationship with the untested Joe. After all, relative to friendship, romantic relationships require a much higher degree of both emotional investment and vulnerability, and therefore carry with themselves a larger potential for hurt feelings and loss. All that being said, if Mary loves Joe, she will be open to relating personally, even if not yet romantically, with him.
Now this sort of gets back to what I was saying. Number one, it doesn't really apply in this case because just starting a friendship with the adoptive mother, with the birth mother, could really introduce, like I said, a lot of confusion and damage and so on. And so, just starting even a minimal friendship wouldn't be the most loving thing to do at that time until she knows that he's confirmed that that's what he wants, to enter into a relationship with her. But then another point actually applies to what I said earlier about the relationship not going as deep. So often, the way you start a relationship can have a huge impact on the trajectory of the relationship. So I mentioned earlier that if you just enter into one and then sort of, just get the thing started and then confirm within the relationship your disposition or change your wrong reasons to the right sort of reasons to be in it, then what winds up happening is it's often the case that it'll get stuck at a lower level of depth and meaning. Similarly, if Joe and Mary just start a friendship, it could get stuck merely at a friendship. And Mary, given what she's heard about Joe, she doesn't want just any old friendship. Sometimes friendships can bud into full-blown romantic relationship, but sometimes they just get stuck at that and it's nice and comfortable and that's it, right? And so she waits for a time until Joe has confirmed that he's really ready and capable of a deep, meaningful romantic relationship before she reveals herself to him. So I don't think Schieber's response works in that regard. Just get the thing started and then sort of make the modifications. Because again, God and Mary don't want just any old relationship. They want a deep, meaningful relationship. And the birth mother also wants a deep, meaningful relationship. She doesn't want a flash in the pan that the guy just goes into it. Her son just goes into it just because he was well disposed. She wants to know that this is really what he wants. And then if that is the case, then they'll work through all the difficulty that comes with any relationship, especially one between a birth mother and an adoptive son or daughter. Now Schieber launches into an interesting, and he hasn't fully developed this, and I by no means mean this as like a knockdown sort of thing. So let me just, in the spirit of friendly amendment, just hoping that he'll develop this more and perhaps even publish on it, let me just offer a few sort of doubts or worries I have just initially. So what Schieber says at the end of the video is that actually what Daniel Howard-Snyder is relying on is the fact that you can have a period of being well disposed but yet lacking the capacity to be in a relationship. Remember, they're being raised and they're getting fed all this sort of like good stuff about this person, and yet then they later actually become capable of a meaningful, deep relationship. And so what Schieber notices, and I think it's a good point, is like we've been assuming this is possible, but what if it's not possible? That is, anytime you become well-disposed, the sorts of capacities that give you the ability to be well-disposed toward a meaningful, deep relationship with God is the same sort of capacities that make you capable of being in the relationship.
Recall that to correct for the misinterpretation in 1996, Howard-Snyder's 2015 paper is repeatedly explicit in referring to the possibility that persons might be well-disposed toward a relationship with God prior to the moment they acquire the cognitive and affective capacities necessary for a personal relationship with God. Now, in our discussion of objections to Howard-Snyder 2015 so far, we have been granting that this is possible. That is, we've been granting that it is possible to become, say, well-disposed toward a relationship with God prior to even being able to relate personally to God. However, I'm not convinced that this is possible. Consider what must be involved in the process of a person becoming well-disposed to a relationship with God. It seems to me that the very process of a person becoming so disposed presupposes or requires several capacities of its own. First, it requires the cognitive capacity to conceive of the target object, in this case God, as a person, a distinct conscious being with their own private mental states. Secondly, it requires the affective capacity to feel positively or negatively about that person as a person. But wait, that sounds an awful lot like the cognitive and affective capacities required for personal relationship with God in the first place. Now, if the capacities required to become well-disposed toward relationship with God are the same capacities required to be in a personal relationship with God, then there just is no time when one does not yet have the capacity for a relationship with God while also having the capacities to become well-disposed or to develop dispositions either positively or negatively toward God. In other words, it is far from clear that Howard-Snyder's proposal here is even possible.
The way that dispositions are often cashed out is there a possibility that isn't actualized. So if a glass has a disposition towards fragility and breaking, then given the right sort of circumstances, being thrown on the ground or dropped, that glass can break, right? So it in a sense has the capacity, but it isn't actualized until the circumstances sort of bring it out. Now, what does this mean with regard to God? What does it mean to be well disposed? Well, I think that when it comes to being well disposed to God, this can happen at a very young age. A very young age, whereby the person still doesn't have the full-blown affective and cognitive capacities to actually be in the sort of relationship that Shellenberg wants, namely a conscious, meaningful, reciprocal relationship, right? Those sort of capacities are either matured to such a level that then they're capable of being in that relationship with God, or they actually come to acquire those capacities, right? So even if you want to say, well, earlier when they're becoming well disposed, they have the relevant sort of capacities, so there's never a time when they are capable of being in a relationship with God and yet are not well disposed, or vice versa. Then I think what you really could say is that It takes time for someone to develop cognitively and emotionally to the point where they actually have the capacity to actually be in one. But they could be well disposed, like the glass is disposed toward breaking, such that the situation becomes right for those capacities, and perhaps those capacities grow such that they are actually ready at that time. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, the glass had the capacity to break the whole time, so doesn't the person have the capacity to be in a relationship? And that may be where the analogy breaks down. And I would say it's true, because we're talking about all or nothing things with the glass. It's either fragile or it's not. But when it comes to cognition and affect, emotion, those things are hugely being developed throughout child rearing. And so someone may start and just have the capacity to such a degree that they do have the capacity, but it's in nascent form, such that saying that they have the same capacity that they do when they're capable of being in a relationship is not really accurate. That is, they do have the same capacity, but it's not developed to the point where they were actually capable of being in the relationship. But they have enough of a capacity there to be well disposed toward entering into the relationship when the time and conditions are right. So, in response to Schieber, or just as a friendly suggestion or amendment or thing to wrestle with, I think the capacity to actually be in a relationship with God and the disposition to be in a relationship with God can totally come apart for developmental reasons, and they aren't always aligned. Now, is it possible that they are? Sure. It's possible later on in life you get the disposition, and at that time you're also capable. But the examples we were giving were often about indoctrination, cultural things involving child rearing, and those sort of things actually do develop often on a trajectory, and it's not all or nothing. I hope that has been helpful. I have really had fun thinking this through. I hope you've had fun. And again, thank you, Justin Schieber, for all the work you put into your videos. I look forward to chatting with you more so. So hopefully I'm going to have him on the Coffee with Philosophers podcast, and we can just have a friendly chat about these issues more. It'd be fun to sort of go back and forth and hopefully press even further on the edge of the literature. So keep thinking critically about Jesus. Keep thinking critically about theism in general, God in general, and keep pressing into the things of God so that you strengthen your faith. Until next time, be well, friend.